It's a fair cop, Gov. You caught me fair and square. But is there any way I could get out of this? Maybe you could let me off and I'll tell you the secret of the SAFeCracker.
The Age of Uncertainty podcast by Nigel. SAFeCracker.
Hi, and welcome to the latest episode of the Age of Uncertainty podcast. You're probably wondering what this one's all about? SAFeCracker? Well, it all comes from an earlier episode I've done about the Nigel scale versus scaling frameworks, where I took my infamous Nigel scale and sort of rammed it into competition and cooperation with some of the major agile scaling approaches out there. Now, if you remember, we had quite a deep dive at the most popular one, the Scaled Agile Framework, or SAFe, and it didn't come out well in that conversation. That video's had a lot of views, but I have had a lot of feedback, both online and offline, about it. Mainly people asking me, well, okay, Nigel, this is great saying there are issues with that SAFe approach, but how can we do it better? So I thought I'll put together a video capturing some of the simple ideas that I have done, or I would like to do with SAFe to try and crack it a little bit. Okay, so we're going to try and take this video as much as we can from a very positive position, from a very yes and. Okay, so if you're looking for a deep dive criticism of SAFe, this isn't that video. This is more about what can we do to make it better for ourselves. Okay, step number one, what can we do? What should be the first thing we should do? Well, first things first, we've got to make some assumptions here. And these may sound like obvious assumptions, but this could be where you save your skin completely. You may not need to crack that SAFe at all. You know, if you're small, or if you're just doing lots of work rather than actual big projects, you may not need SAFe at all. So the assumptions we're making are that you're already using it, or you have to use it, or there is a very compelling argument for some reason for you to be using it. But if you can avoid doing any of this, I would. Famously, I once went to the doctor with a pain in my chest a few years ago, and I was really rather worried about it. There could be angina, my father had a heart attack, I was really concerned. And I went to the doctor and told him about this pain. He asked me, do I get pains when I do exercise? I said, no. He said, well, when do you get the pain then? And I said, well, when I put my arm up like this. And so he said, well, stop doing it then. Thanks, Doc. That's actually a very famous Tommy Cooper joke, the famous British comedian. But it is kind of true. If you can avoid it, do. But if you can't, let's take some steps into this SAFe. Okay, so we've decided for some reason we've got to do this SAFe thing. So what options have I got? Well, SAFe is an overloaded term. There are many flavors of SAFe out there. There's a few different varieties they offer. And so what I would do as step number one is take the thinnest possible version we can. That, at the moment of doing this video, is the essential SAFe version. I would take that. So I would not use those heavier versions. I would completely put those to one side and I'd focus on the simplest one available so far. So what would I do next? Well, I've got this 5-point plan I'd probably attempt, and we'll go into each point in the plan in depth. Point number one is I would derive the Nigel scale from my own values and principles, either Scrum or Agile or maybe even SAFe. Number two, I would analyze SAFe via the Nigel scale. Number three, I would then start deleting those Nigel scale 3 practices out with some gap analysis. Number four, I would then enhance the Nigel scale 1, the core practices, and of course do that based around supporting, mitigating, and maybe even eliminating those gaps. And then finally, what do we do in Agile? We iterate. I would go back to step one again, derive and analyze again. So the first step really is about deriving the Nigel scale. Okay, why would we do that? Well, do you know what? The Nigel scale is kind of Nigel's scale. You know, I have set it, and I'm not going to claim I'm some universal truth that you must follow. No, I'm not going to claim that. I'm really not going to claim that. You probably won't get success if you just go back to work and say, hey, I've got this agile scale of a guy called Nigel. He does some YouTube videos. He's got an English accent. That won't really help, will it? So if you can actually derive from first principles your own version of the Nigel scale, that will really help give you some validity. Now, and I'm thinking about writing about this soon, I think there is some wiggle in some of this Nigel scale work. The Nigel scale is fundamentally based on Scrum. Okay, that's originally where it came from, defining what Scrum is, what Scrum isn't. Now, we can use it in other contexts, because of course there is some inheritance here. If it's based fundamentally on Scrum, then of course all the agile values and principles sort of get sucked in with it as well. So they're all fundamental core things: Agile Manifesto, Agile Principles, and Scrum. But in fact, if you look at Scrum, it's probably the deeper underlying patterns that make up Scrum. So it's not so much, oh, the Scrum law says you have self-organizing teams. It's the idea that self-organizing teams as a pattern has been around in Agile and long before Agile, helping successful companies build successful products. So that's kind of what Scrum is, this minimum viable product of pre-existing high-performing patterns. Those patterns, those principles, and that manifesto make up Nigel's scale of the Nigel scale. But I can understand for some people that does not match. For some people, they're more agile than Scrum. So for them, it's purely the Agile Manifesto and principles. Now for me, that's a bit too light, but I can accept and appreciate that is a way they want to use the Nigel scale. So for them, the core is just the values and principles. I could even see some people adding some more things into that core, depending on their background, depending on where they come from. Like, I guess if they're from the Kanban world, some of the key values and principles there are around visualization and minimization. So maybe that will be brought into the Nigel scale. However, what we don't want is people sort of being, oh yeah, the core, I'm going to use the Nigel scale, and core is some of the agile values and principles and some of the manifesto. That is just corrupting the very base we stand on, and I wouldn't accept the use of the Nigel scale in such a manner. So I am open-minded. I can understand there is some wiggle in there between what is core and what is not, but I would want us not to step too far from that fundamental values, principles, patterns behind Scrum, else I think we'll get into some trouble. Okay, don't take this too seriously, but I've got this fun little chart about practices versus principles. And I just want to make it clear that if you go too extreme in any of these boxes, you can end up with one of these titles. So there are some people out there who have no practices, no principles. My God, they're effectively alley cats. They're amoral, okay? There are some people out there who are quite stiff with their practices, but don't believe the principles behind it. I would say if you're too far in that box, you're a cynic. What about the people who are all about the principles, but not about the practices? That's a bit of a hippie if you're not too careful. And those are all about strong practices and strong principles. Well, I'm afraid they're the zealots. Where would I put myself in this silly little chart? Well, I think I'm on that zealot side, I'm afraid to say. Hopefully not too zealous, but with a bit of zeal. I like to say I'm a fundamentalist. Doesn't mean I'm extreme, just means I'm really strict on the fundamentals. There are lots of agile people more in the hippie space. Hey, it's all about principles, who cares about practices? That's a bit watered down for me. But somewhere in that space wouldn't be too bad. I think if you're drifting into cynic or you're drifting into alley cat, that's where we can end up corrupting this. So we want to try and keep our principles in place with this Nigel scale to make sure we use it appropriately. Okay, words. I'm not even going to appear on camera. I'm just going to put loads of words on the screen. Ready? Let's go. Right, so if you want to be really clever, I think you could finesse the Nigel scale, not from agile principles, not from Scrum principles, but maybe from your own organizational principles. So if one of your organizational principles is let's help people be amazing, you could probably derive the Nigel scale from that. But if you're in a real sticky situation, as we say in cricket, a real sticky wicket, you could perhaps derive these from the SAFe principles. Now here they are, the 10 of them. I'm not going to read them out. I in fact found this quote online from a very famous SAFe reseller. We have always found these to be quite obtuse and inaccessible. Ouch! Yeah, they are kind of. And in fact, if you read them, I'm not sure they're principles. A few of those read kind of like practices to me. But if you're clever, if you forget that some of these aren't really principles at all, you could come up with a compelling argument to derive the Nigel scale from this. You could take some of these terms about, building incrementally with fast cycles to really double down on that inspect and adapt concept and really make sure that Nigel scale is built from the right principles. Okay? And then when we start analyzing SAFe, we're doing it from its own principles point of view and not from importing an older, better agile method into it. You're using the method to improve the method. Next one, we're going to analyze SAFe, and we're not going to do that for you again in this video. I'm so sorry. There was some analysis in the previous scaling frameworks video. Feel free to use that. But what I really don't want you doing is outsourcing the analysis to other people. This should really be something you are deriving yourself, okay? We can help you if you want. The videos are there are conversations online you can have. There are people you can hire to do it with you, but it needs to be owned by you. Otherwise, that analysis is just the opinion of an outsider, not an opinion of you, okay? But it is important for you to do this, I believe, to get a sense for you in your organization, which of those parts of SAFe are bad, which of them are core, and which of them are just good. Then we do a gap analysis. But I don't mean a gap analysis in a traditional sense. I mean more a GAP analysis, good agile practice. Okay? Because when you start, let's say, analyzing this thing and start looking at areas where we want to perhaps remove bad patterns, well, the patterns may be bad, but it doesn't mean the problem they were trying to solve was wrong. Okay? It could be it's an entirely incorrect hypothesis from begin to finish and we can throw it all away. But it could well be it's a bad answer to a legitimate problem. And if we throw away the answer, well, the problem doesn't go away, does it? There's got to be something to fill that gap. The idea of this gap analysis or GAP analysis is do a bit of thinking about those gaps between where you currently are and the future state you want to be, and see if there is some good agile practice you can use there. Now, we know it's not one size fits all. We know we mustn't copy and paste from other organizations, but you also don't want to reinvent the wheel. That's a huge waste of money. If there is some very good stuff out there that works legitimately, we should perhaps appreciate that could fill the gap rather than all of us starting from ground zero every single time. Basically, what I'm trying to say is, as a good agile coach, scrum master, manager, leader in a SAFe organization, you need to kiss ass. No, God, I don't mean not like that. No. I'm not being rude. It's this. Kiss ass. KISAS. Keep it simple at scale. You're going to have to keep this thing simple at scale, right? Complexity breeds, and you're going to have to stay on top of that. So when we talk about stripping things away, it's to make the system as simple as possible. Why do we want that? It's because the famous quote by D. Hock, the founder of Visa, simple and clear purpose and principles give rise to complex, intelligent behavior. Complex rules and regulations give rise to simple, stupid behavior. We do not want a complex system filled with drones. What we want is simple systems to allow clever people to flourish within. Now, the best example I've seen of this is kind of like the doozers from Fraggle Rock. Now, for God's sake, if you don't know what Fraggle Rock is, watch it on YouTube. I don't want to get into an explanation of Jim Henson's 1980s Muppet series here, but in Fraggle Rock, there were these creatures called doozers. Now, doozers effectively built infrastructure. They built scaffolding. They built these little, these crystal clear shapes, these buildings, these little structures all over the Fraggles' home. Now, these actual structures, they're like candy cane. They're sweets. And so the Fraggles will break them and eat them. Now, you may think that sounds pretty awful. Like these people are building, doing hard work, and the Fraggles are just reaping the benefits of their work. But actually, it was slightly cleverer than that, like most Jim Henson products are. The idea was that if the doozers' work wasn't periodically cleared, they would actually get tired, the space would fill up, and they would die. So the doozers needed something to keep keeping that infrastructure removed. They needed something to keep clearing away their building so they could keep building. That's kind of how organizations work. Keep it simple is an ongoing activity, not a one-off phase. Because you may simplify your approaches, but gosh, you start building products like doozers, you start adding more and more to it, making it more complex, more difficult to use. You processes, every time something goes wrong in an organization, a process gets added to try and fix that gap, make sure it doesn't happen again. We naturally build that Byzantine structure around us. You know the old story, 2's company, 3's politics. Whenever you get human beings together, they create hierarchies, they create structures, they create politics, and in the end, all these things, products, process, politics, they're all about power in organizations and how that flows, ebbs, or doesn't flow and doesn't ebb. And that will continuously build, even in the most agile organization. What we want to do in terms of as organizational change agents, as people looking to make our businesses better, is just to keep on top of that. Understanding that these things will grow naturally, they will grow organically, but also they'll get in the way and make things more difficult to do and more difficult to use. So as good organizational fraggles, we need to clear down that mess as much as we can. Product, process, and politics, as much as we can. Working on it all the time. That's a job for life, not just for Christmas. But I do want to make it quite clear that kiss ass is not clear. If you know anything about Cynefin, I love to talk about Cynefin. And Cynefin's got these various sort of pond spaces it likes to discuss. Used to be called simple, then it became obvious, now it's called clear. Then there's complicated, complex and chaotic, of course with confused in the middle. Well, kiss ass does not mean clear. You notice I said earlier on, we're trying to create clear systems. That isn't strictly true. That was shorthand. What we're trying to do is create clear frameworks, clear trellis for the new systems, the new processes, the new products to grow within it. So it's not about trying to simplify your organization to a limit of unrealistic expectations or making it like a factory. It's not like that at all. It's just making sure these sort of meta frameworks, these trellises that we're building are clear and simple, allowing our processes and our products to grow and evolve organically within. I think the famous agile coach John Barnes said it best. In fact, I don't think it was John Barnes. I think it was actually the band New Order, working with the comedian Keith Allen, and the 1990s English World Cup football team came up with the song World in Motion. A song close to my heart. Express yourself, create the space, you know you can win, don't give up the chase. What we're trying to do with this kiss ass approach is create space for things to grow. Why? The danger of good practice. We spoke about gap analysis earlier on. Or as they say on the London Underground, mind the gap. Good agile practices. Good for who? A lot of people think we have best practices in our world. They cut and paste practices from other organizations because they work there, so they're gonna work here. No, that's not true. Just because they work there doesn't mean they'll work here. There's a chance they'll work here. They're a good practice. It may work here, but may is doing a lot of heavy lifting in that sentence. So we've got to be careful with this, right? From two sides of the coin. One side is, we're very special as a company. We do very special things as a company. What those other companies do, that can't work for us. That's silly. You're not so special. There are lots of classic universal things that seem to work again and again and again in many places. Having said that, it's not one size fits all. It's not a cut and paste. We should never be assuming other people's problems are the same as ours and other people's solutions will solve our problems. Okay? One major reason behind that is actually because good practices alter over time. You probably heard me talk about this before with my Nigel scale. I've been talking about how good practices alter and change over experience and time in organizations. So if you start snapshotting by saying that is a good practice and this is not, you get into a lot of trouble because a heavy dependent factor there is actually the skill and the ability of the team. So I'm trying to show here a classic from sprint backlogs. People often used to say, you must estimate your sprint backlog. You must break it down. You must estimate all the work. If you don't, you are bad. And then people discovered, hang on a minute, this estimation is a waste of time for me. It's actually bad to estimate my work in my sprint backlog. I need to keep it unestimated. Well, of course, both sides of the conversations were right. They were just looking at the elephant from different ends. They were just appreciating different ends of the same problem. It was legitimate for those new teams to do some sort of breakdown and some estimation. And in the more mature teams, they didn't need to do it. But recently, I've been trying to add other factors to this. Because this is just looking at one team, like the experience at the time of one team, okay? What other factors could affect it in organizations? What about organizational ability? Now, I've talked about Shuhari before. You can find it all over the internet, but very quickly, just to make sure you know what it is. Used by Alistair Cockburn, it comes from martial arts, Shuhari. The idea of Shu is you follow the idea slavishly, you follow the martial arts slavishly. You may not know exactly why you're doing certain things, but you do them to build up knowledge and build up experience. The best example I've ever seen of that was the 1980s movie Karate Kid, wax on, wax off. Do you remember that? That's Shu. Then there's Ha, that's when you're a black belt, you understand, you know the martial art, you understand how it works, you're an expert in it, so to speak. And then Ri is when you've transcended the martial art. That's when you're a master of the thing. You are Bruce Lee. What you do is the martial art, and the martial art is what you do. The two sides of the same coin are completely interwoven. Well, what I've been experimenting with recently is trying to map that factor onto practices. Because what I've seen, you see, it's been a hard year, COVID, I'll be honest with you. I've done a lot of training, but nowhere near as much coaching as I would like. I've historically always regarded myself as a coach first, someone who goes into organizations, not just someone who talks about organizations. But a lot of my experiences right from the start of my Scrum career have been in what I would call large shoe enterprises. Organizations that don't quite know what they're doing yet with these types of practices. And what I found is that is a factor almost like gravity. Like if you can imagine like a gravity weighing on every practice we do. I found in some shoe organizations that gravity of shoe has sort of pulled core practices into good. People have thought, these things actually are optional, aren't they? They're not really core. Or worse still, pulled the other way, pulled bad practices into the viable box. Does that make it viable? No, it just makes people believe it could be viable. That sort of negative gravity, sort of trying to push practices out of their spaces, I think is a dangerous thing. I think it's something we don't talk enough about. I don't think people really appreciate those factors and how they affect how we work. I do know a lot of people use them as excuses. They say, hey, we're in an organization that's new to Agile, thus we must break the rules. Forcing that core stuff to become optional or forcing that bad stuff to become good. And that's wrong. I think that's profoundly wrong. We need to push back on those gravitational forces. But if you're in more of a Ri or more of a Ha organization, I would definitely say those forces could be different. Maybe non-existent, but definitely different. And that would affect how these practices work for us in those organizations. I could easily imagine, for instance, things like no estimates, continuous delivery being very viable in those Ri and Ha organizations, and yet being quite a difficult sell in a shoe one. You have to remember, context is king. No team is an island. We're all in the same ecosystem together. Chet Hendrickson, one of the original extreme programmers in Chrysler, was there as member of the team when extreme programming was invented. He recently introduced me to this idea of Kentucky windage. Now, I don't really know what it is, but supposedly if you're into shooting, it's when you have to sort of aim ahead of what you're trying to shoot at because of factors like wind. And so you sort of aim ahead and then the various trajectories and the wind factors sort of bend your shot back to being on target again. I think I could see an argument for things like that in shoe organizations because that organization is putting that status quo gravity onto your processes. You have to sort of aim them slightly more idealistic and slightly more extreme so they come back less when bent by that gravity. Could I give an example of this? Yeah, I think, we're talking about safe now in terms of safe cracking. What I'll probably do is try and, rather than, because I'm in a new organization, turn down values and principles, I would probably actually try and turn them up to a higher level to try and overcome the organizational inertia that is fighting against us. Of course, another thing to take into account when you're trying to crack safe is what problem space you're trying to solve. Okay, a lot of the safe methods for me are Nigel scale 2, but a lot of them drift into Nigel scale 3 depending on your problem. There are certain techniques that I quite like, having like things like release trains that I found quite useful a long time ago in big, heavy, slow enterprises. But if I'm doing complex work, if I'm doing inspect and adapt, we don't know the right way to work. We need to run experiments. We need to emerge our processes and emerge our practices. Then some of those potentially Nigel scale 2 factors of safe could deeply and quickly fall into bad or anti-practice. Okay? Anti-patterns that are dangerous for us. And so using something like Cynefin to understand your problem space, I think could really help us here as well, because that may actually help you redefine some of those potential attributes. And that may be different team to team, company to company. I saw a quote on Twitter, but I can't remember who said it, so that's not a great way to start the quote. But it was something like, I've seen no successful product development companies using SAFe. And that's kind of harsh, but I can kind of understand that. In that if we look at Kent Beck's work here on explore, expand, and extract, his idea of, is similar to Cynefin, his idea that there are certain problem spaces where you're investing, the main tool is learning, you're trying to discover more about it. There's no big comeback in terms of money, you're just trying to learn, and then once you find your right fit, then you can expand, then your aim is to remove bottlenecks into scale, to get volume, to get value out. And then finally extract, or some people call exploit, you're effectively a miner mining. You've got a well-dug canyon, a well-dug mine of which you are just pulling out resources and value, okay? I think if you are in extract or exploit, I think something like a safe approach could be far more valid than if you're in explore or expand. Or if you have to use safe, more of safe would be valid. And in an explore or expand area, even less would be valid on that Nigel scale. So I think those factors would pull down things from good to bad, depending on how early you were in that experience. I do feel that a lot of safe, from the conversations I've had and where I've seen it, has been used in areas of extract more than expand or explore. I think that's where it comes from. And I think it could be valid there. So I've actually seen some successful product companies using SAFe. The joke is they've just not used SAFe on the successful product bits. They've used it on the other bits, the supporting, the surrounding infrastructure. And again, that could be valid. But I think if we take into account something like this, something like Cynefin, definitely something like Shuhari in terms of organization, and take into account that pressure on the various practices that we may or may not do, I think that would give us a third dimension of understanding, or a deeper understanding of how this stuff works, to help us make some better decisions about it. Because the dangers of good practice, just because it's good for me doesn't mean it's good for you. Don't take my word for it. You need to run experiments. If you want safe to work, you need to make it safe to fail. Okay, it needs to be able to collapse, able to fall over, and able to be able to get back up. You need to run it in an experiment-driven model. And then we need to delete bad practice, and that's easier said than done. Behind every product is a process. Behind every process is a person. Behind every person is politics and power. And so there's going to be a difficult conversation. You can't just run around with an axe hacking things away, right? So for me, actually deleting bad practice should only be done up front, should only be done by people like us when it really isn't safe to fail. When actually, if we institute that practice, it will, one, endanger us to a level of danger that we cannot accept. And two, it may be irreversible. So I'll give an example. I worked with an organization that got a new CEO. A CEO very much not aligned with the values and principles of that organization. Well, you would think, okay, the CEO would come in, they would misalign with the values and principles, either the CEO wins or the organization wins, but something is resolved. But what actually started to happen was that CEO, the first thing they started to do was to maneuver the board into a position when the CEO couldn't be got rid of. So before the CEO started doing things and changing things and getting feedback, they maneuvered the position so that if things failed, they were still in place. They basically removed the safety net, the controls that the board had before they started running their work. And that's dangerous, right? It's all well and good to run experiments, but if you remove the safety nets around the experiments, we've all heard some very famous stories, how that led to some very big famous accidents. Oh, we just turned off the safety controls. And so only delete bad practice from like a leadership or a consulting stance up front when it is truly deadly or if it cannot be reversed. Okay, if reversing it is too dangerous, because some bad practices are hellish sticky. But generally, otherwise, I'll try and remove bad practice gradually. We are in an ing world, not an ed world. You know, we are in a scaling world, we are not in a scaled world. We are in a changing world, we are not in a changed world. You may all know, and if you don't, I'll put a link here on the screen. I've started writing a blog again, and it's basically going to turn into a book on agile transformation, a book on agile organizations, a book on agile changing, a book on ing. Not ING, the Dutch company, I mean ing, because it's a big thing for me, is ing. And so how could we ing safe? Well, we can understand that it's a journey. It's not a destination, it's a journey. Safe is a stepping stone towards a better life. It isn't the better life. And so what I would do with bad practices and even with good practices, I would try and put best before dates or use by dates on them. Probably if it's bad, a use by date, because if you eat food after the use by date is up, the food is off. And probably put best before dates on good practices. I.e., when it gets to the best before date, you can still eat it, but it may just be a bit soggy, the biscuit, or a bit dry, the cake. So I'll put use by dates and best before dates on those practices and on those processes in SAFe. So we can effectively start planning the transitioning, planning the changing, not just the introduction, but actually the winding out of SAFe. Okay? The decompiling of SAFe, the cracking of SAFe in your organization. Effectively, what we're trying to do here is have an evidence-based approach rather than a theoretical conceptual one. So we use experiments, we take an experiment-driven approach to gradually delete this agile austerity, gradually remove those bad practices, gradually remove those good practices that no longer become valid and evolve ourselves to a better approach. We said about Nigel scale earlier on, put Nigel scale and SAFe together, but if you haven't got the power to make these changes with that magic wand, it's going to be harder. But it could be safest. What do I mean by that? Well, if we haven't got the power to make big changes, we're going to have to make lots of little subtle changes with evidence. So the idea of safest is scaled agile framework, experiment-led, systematic transitioning. Okay? Experiment-led, systematic transitioning. We start off deriving the Nigel scale as we did before. We analyze SAFe according to the Nigel scale. We then enhance Nigel Scale 1 practices, build up those muscles of those values, those principles, those fundamental Scrum patterns. Once those muscles are built, then we develop up Nigel Scale 2 practices, good practices through gap analysis to fill the gaps, to experiment. Then we start deleting Nigel Scale 3 practices, and we do all that through experiments. So we run experiments to do that. Then we get the feedback, then we go back to one and iterate again. So effectively, you're doing a little bit each time. You're enhancing those values and principles, those fundamental patterns. You're developing up those good practices. You're deleting those bad practices, a little slice each time. Iterate, iterate, iterate. By iterating your frameworks, you are scaling, you are changing, potentially you are growing, you are doing all these things to improve and improve and improve that space. Ing over ed, scaling over scaled. The best way to start is start small. And I don't just mean start your transformation small. I don't mean start your SAFeCracking small. I mean start the actual building of your product small. Many big products didn't need to be that big. They're big because they have got to big somehow. Maybe because we use traditional approaches to build this thing. If you can start small and iterate, grow your processes empirically and interactively, Be like a Fraggle, but embrace doozerism. Understand that doozerism is natural. People will build hierarchies, frameworks all over the place. But be a Fraggle and keep cracking it, right? By doing that, by evolving, if you can, from that ground up, you may end up not where you thought you'd be, and maybe not where I hoped you'd be, but where you need to be. And in the end, that's what we need to do. I have a vision of what I would like you to be. You probably have a vision of where you'd like to be. Those visions are probably wrong. If we inspect this, if we use empirical feedback and evidence on this, grind it out, you'll get to a point that'll be good for all of us. Finally, Spotify. I think the best lesson you can learn from Safe is don't be like Spotify. I've got this quote here, I'm going to read it to you. The Spotify model is disqualified as it isn't even a method but a book report about something that wasn't done, hasn't been done, and will never be done. Plus, if you think blindly photocopying some ideas from a Swedish music streamer is a success pattern, I'm not sure you've been paying attention for the last hour. So that famous quote was from an agile coach called Nigel Baker. Yes, it's me. Yeah. Rather than do any research at all, I've just quoted myself. But what we see with the Spotify model is people took other people's experience reports, other people's ideas, hypotheses they haven't tested, and just cut and paste it into their organizations blindly as if it would work, right? That doesn't work, okay? And a lot of people appreciate that now. Taking someone else's experience report and cutting and pasting into a business does not make you that business. I'm afraid to say, Safe especially, but a lot of these scaling approaches out there are pretty much the same thing. One organization's good experience, cut and paste into every other organization like a best experience. So please take everything you do with a pinch of salt. Inspect and adapt, build empirical evidence to drive your change forward. It's changing, not changed. And that's what makes it interesting. Okay, we've come to the end. I hope that was quick. I hope that was fun. I hope it was useful. There's some ideas there I think you can do something with, take ownership of, to really help get this thing improved in your own environment. If you want to talk more about it, I am available for this type of thing. Remember, I'm an agile coach first. I don't just do training courses and podcasts. So give me a shout at some of the details at the end of the video, the little advertising sequence. Have a look in there, give me a shout. We could always do some sort of masterclass on this if you're particularly interested, either in your organization or with other friends and colleagues. By the way, I haven't said it in a while, but please could you share these videos? Please could you subscribe to my YouTube channel? Please could we disseminate this a bit? It takes me a lot of time and effort to build this information up, to build this work, and it'd be lovely if we could spread it a bit wider. But enough of the speeches. I've enjoyed it. I hope you have also. Thank you for watching the first episode of 2021. I'll see you again soon. Cheers everyone. Bye.
Next episode, Agile Versary, 20 years of the Agile Manifesto.